Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 7th edition of Chebacco Chats. We have a very special guest with us, Eloise Schultz. Eloise has been a lot of different things for the Mount Desert Islands Historical Society. You've been our outreach coordinator. You're good with graphics. You've been a copy editor for a couple of issues of Chebacco. You've headed up our History Harvest program where you're collecting histories from the community. And then you went and left us 2 years ago and went off to Oregon State University to pursue your Master of Fine Arts. And you focused on poetry, and you've been teaching, and you've just graduated, and you're about to come back. And we're really glad to have you back.
Thanks, Tim. I'm really happy to be coming back.
Yeah, and we're going to depart from the usual topic of Chebacco Chats. We're going to talk about your work in poetry and how poetry informs your life and how the histories of Mount Desert Island are represented in your work as a poet. So let me get the right screen up here, and we're going to do that next. Just take a moment. I think I have this down by now. Okay, we're looking at the right one?
Yeah, it looks great.
Big screen. Okay, good. Well, thanks for your patience, everyone. We're live on Zoom and on Facebook Live. Our guest is Eloise Schultz. She's a poet returning to us from Oregon State University. And Eloise, I had the privilege of watching your thesis last week, your thesis defense. And your thesis was different than a lot that I've seen. You have published a book of poems called Dugout. And here's the cover. First thing we have to ask is, why this title to your book of poems?
A good question, Tim. And it's a play off of Dugout Canoe, which operates as a motif throughout the collection. But I also chose to separate it into two words, dug out, to suggest a state of excavation that's always going on. The thesis collection is very focused on the theme of poetry and subterranean knowledge. And so the ground operates as a metaphor for finding history underground. And Dug Out kind of explores that. Tim, I think that we're actually not yet in the full screen view.
Okay.
Sorry. It's going to be important to make the words bigger because they're small. That looks perfect. Yeah, thanks.
Got it now? Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So, give us an introduction. How did your work at the Historical Society inform your work as a poet? You left this world on Mount Desert Island, went to the other coast. How were you influenced by your experience here?
Well, I think what I learned in my first couple weeks writing poems in my grad program was that I had to write about what I was immersed in. And what I had spent the last couple years immersed in was history, and especially our attempt at the Historical Society to interpret history and to share it and to preserve it. And so I really started thinking about those as themes. Specifically focusing on ways of gathering community around historical engagement. And I think it was also maybe a way of connecting with the island while I was gone and missing it, because I was able to think about the relationships that I had built and some of the best memories and projects, and also the curiosities and trouble, the ways that I still kind of felt troubled about what I had been working on. And I wanted to explore that further. And I'm glad this is a picture of the vintage classroom. And what I love about it is that it's part of the magic of the program is that everyone involved is dressed in 19th century clothing and figuring out how to reenact different roles in the Sound Schoolhouse. But that also involves play. And so that was actually a big part of my project, is both figuring out how to talk about history and inhabit it, and incorporating play and pretend and making that very obvious as part of my method.
That sounds like a very poetical thing you just said, to think about, I think you said something like thinking about inhabiting history, or thinking about history and inhabiting it. Tell us, go a little further on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, I guess I use inhabit because I want to draw attention to the way that we live in history. The ways that we live are all, that their social forms are all kind of created through these patterns of the way that we behave with one another, the way that social norms have changed over time. One thing that I've been really interested in through the Historical Society is thinking about everyday lives through history. When I was working on oral histories, I ended up just asking a lot of questions about everyday lives, because I found it hard to guess what people in the future were going to want to know about now, about like the major events that we're currently living through. And I found that the best way to get at the emotional heart of that was to really think about everyday life, and the way that we process emergencies, but also the kind of day-to-day thing that keeps us going through that experience.
Okay, so
Yeah.
maybe another way to answer this question of how history and your poetry intersect is to have you read us a poem. And here is one that appears in your book. It's titled Preface. And could you read it to us?
I will. Thanks, Tim. So this is the first section. This is the first poem in a section called Sedimental Archive. Preface. Considering the circumstances, permit me some caveats concerning my lack of credentials, contextualizing that mine is a non-native voice, a settler in a context of settlers, constant awareness that the containers in and about which I write are composed by whiteness, and concern that mine will overwrite any space I attempt to curate. Contention that an institutional power is maintained through repression, burying, forgetting, reshaping. Corroboration. Our museum in Soamesville sits at the edge of Soames Landing on Soames Sound, named for some guy who sailed a fishing boat here 250 years ago. Commitment to speak of and for community, a collective in collection. Correcting for bias means exposing the terms of its authority. Cached in rocks and relics, the lake's memory, sedimental archives. Conditionally, the lake becomes a metaphor for repression. I can't tell what's underneath.
And the way this poem is shaped is very different, and the way it appears, and we can flip back, but it has many footnotes in it. And on the next page, you go to those footnotes. So get us oriented here.
Yeah, so actually, to create this poem, you'll see, if anyone, for readers of Chebacco, you'll notice that it is kind of similar to the way that Chebacco articles are formatted, with a narrative that has lots of footnotes that might contain thoughts or notes or citations to some of the source material. And I was interested in inverting an article to kind of show a lot of the emotional and thought processes happening under the surface. So I liked footnotes because they actually gave me that vertical relationship. So in here, in these footnotes, we've got quotes from the Mount Desert Islander. In some places, I'm trying to let the headline speak for itself. Tim, there's one, number 4, I've actually taken the title of one of your lectures, which I love, written in granite. Just because those words were suggesting some ways of engaging with history that I thought were important to this poem. But then I've also got quotes from this year's edition of Chebacco. And when he came and filmed the Vintage Classroom and talked about some of the kids' experiences, that leads to the last line, where one visitor asks, "Is this real?" Which I love, just also because of all the different layers of performance and pretending and imagination that it speaks to, and the different ways that we engage and activate historical knowledge through performance.
Well, it seems like an immediate difference I see from the kind of reading that I'm likely to do every day. Compared to what you've just described, I skim what I'm reading. I read rather fast. And here you've really given some thought to how it's put together. I would guess that many readers don't read the footnotes. I often do. I'm very interested in how the material is based. But there's a level of intensity in your reading as a poet and your work as a poet. You have to really slow down, or I have to, and engage with this material very, very thoughtfully. And it sounds like maybe that has an influence on the way you live your life too.
That's a really provocative question. I think it does, but I think that poetry for me is a really sacred space for that slowing down. And so I was, because this is such a non-traditional form, and because it's kind of academic, and I wanted to experiment with what calling it a poem would mean. How does it change the way that we read it if we say that it's a poem? How do we read words differently when we're attentive to the different registers of meaning that they carry? So in the first section, playing off of the word some and then the name Soames was one way that I could do that by calling this a poem, to kind of draw attention to the way that this sort of like everyday, like kind of casual way of talking about something was actually embedded in the name that is such an important part of the history of Soamesville, and actually how that name is so embedded in all the other kinds of names that we use on the island every day. And so poetry allows me to pay attention to that and to try to activate that awareness in a document.
Well, there's also, and this is a fun picture of you at the schoolhouse. Tell us what's going on here with Linda Ubersater in the background.
Yeah, we are carding wool. Linda's holding one of our wool carders. I think that I had gotten that wool from Peggy Rockefeller Farm. It's in the basket. And while the vintage classroom was going on, while the students were inside, being taught by the fabulous Maud March, we would sit outside and we would talk about what we were going to do, and we would card wool. And while we were doing that, I took this selfie because it was a wonderful moment. But it also just, it was really fun. And I think so many aspects of that project are totally joyful to step into the roles that would have been the roles of people who lived 100 years ago then, but also to have fun with it ourselves and work with our hands. And that's really important to me.
I seem to recall the wool smelled really bad.
I think that's a matter of opinion.
Oh,
I like
that.
the wool smell. It's lanolin. It's an animal smell. Yeah, it was. Actually, that was an important part of the project, I think, for the students, because they would take a handful of this kind of greasy wool and they would stick it to their face and go, "Oh, ew, it's so gross." But it's what sheep smell like, and it's the reason why we wash it, the wool too. So that was like a way of really engaging all the senses in a historical experience.
And I want to tie your work as a poet to your work as a copy editor. I would suppose that copy editor is one of the more underappreciated aspects of putting together a journal like Chebacco. So just briefly, what do you do as a copy editor?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So as a copy editor, I basically read every inch and centimeter of the manuscript and make sure that it's all aligning to our Chebacco Manual of Style, which is kind of an adaptation of the Chicago Manual of Style. And the reason to do that is so that it's formatted consistently and so that readers know how to find the information that they need when they read it, whether they're looking in the footnotes or they need to know, what book titles are book titles or a ship's name is a ship's name. And so it is really tedious work, but because it's careful work, you have to be very meticulous, and you have to read very closely and have this idea in your head of what it should look like. And I end up, as I'm copy editing Chebacco, often doing a lot of side research. So at the same time, I'm sort of fact checking, and I'm combing through the articles to make sure that they're also aligned with the way that we want to talk about history and present it. And so actually I consider that it's a political job in a way, copy editing. It's because the standards of style impose a certain way of thinking about the world and like what information needs to be capitalized or not. So I actually wrote a poem about it called Copy Edit that maybe demonstrates that more clearly.
I just happen to have that poem queued up.
Fantastic.
So would you read it to us?
Okay. Yeah. Copy edit. Remove italics. Add quotation marks around the rich man. Change everything to the colony. After landscapers, add specializing in summer homes. Can a band really be said to specialize in the Star-Spangled Banner? Political corruption needs a complete source. Who are average Americans in this context? Remove capitals from territory, founding fathers, state, imperial, colonial, and patriot. Titles not given as part of a name, such as your repeated use of president, should remain lowercase unless the ego rule is in effect. Again, what is it? Could you reveal enough of yourself in this sentence to invite criticism of your implicit judgments without appearing defensive and while forwardly embracing the risks of reparative writing? Perhaps you could choose a more precise word than the past?
I think if some of our authors are watching this program, they might recognize some of your commentary. In fact, in the last line, I have a sneaking suspicion that might have been directed to me. Perhaps could you choose a more precise word than the past?
Yeah, well, that's a tricky one, because is there a more precise word than the past? I mean, I think it's a good question, but I put it at the end because I think it actually pointed to some of the failures of language in the way that we like conceptualize time. So that was actually a big part of my project, and I think totally inspired by my work at the Historical Society, is what do we call past and present and future, and how do we come up with those terms? How do we think about those things?
So often what you're asking of our authors is greater precision. Mm-hmm. And usually there is, often there is a way to talk more precisely about the past. There's a year, there's a day, there's a month. But often authors who are writing about history are lured astray by little hiding places where they don't know the detail. They might write in the passive voice, things happened, and or something was in the past, because there's this gap in what they know, and often you're demanding something a little more direct, which makes it more accessible and real to the audience.
I think that's a great point. Yeah, the copy editor exists sometimes to make sure that we're trying our best, I guess, and if there's a gap in time, to pay attention to that and to think about it. So in the same way that regular general editing improves our thinking, I think copy editing does that, but on a very word level, even a letter level.
Yeah. So let's, this is, I think we have time for a last poem that kind of returns to a question I asked you earlier, that it seems like history informs your poetry, and poetry informs your way of seeing the world. And I've seen you in the world, Eloise, and so often you have a notebook and a pencil with you. And as you read this next poem titled Clefstone, I can kind of picture you going through an evening with a notebook and pencil in hand.
Clefstone. Our house was full of people, invited by the landlord. There was nowhere to be alone beside the ferns. It was Beck's birthday. We sang the rutabaga song. I dragged my sleeping bag high above the berry ledges. Wind stirred the gentle dark. By dawn, my sadness turned. I watched the island flicker, brake lights in procession, snaking up the flank of our gated mountain garden of paradise. Some 2,000 years after the birth of Jesus, give or take discrepancies between lunar solar calendars.
It sounds like quite a night.
We all have them, Tim.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, let's see. I think I want to open up our conversation to the audience and invite others to ask us questions. So folks listening, if you're on Facebook or on Zoom, why don't you pose some questions to us? I'm sure we'd love to hear from you. And I do have something to ask you, Eloise, and that is, what do you think that people who don't read poetry frequently might be missing?
Well, I think that poetry offers us, we've talked about a way of slowing down with words and language, but I think that poetry also offers us the opportunity to reinvent language, to find new ways of making meaning with old words that and old patterns of using words. And so I think that poetry also is an opportunity to have fun with language in that way. I find that in my daily life, it makes me pay attention. Mary Oliver talks about that a lot, is that poetry is a way of paying attention and answering to the world. Every time I read a poem, I'm amazed at how much it's a world unto itself, created by that poet. And every poem is totally different and shows us a new way of thinking about the world with and through language. So that's why I love reading it. You can also read it at the gym on a treadmill, or you can bring it on the bus. It's so portable. And so it's an incredibly variable art form that I think has a place everywhere.
And who, tell us about your one or two favorite poets. I've seen you thrust a book of poetry into my wife Lynn's hands and insist that she start reading. Who's on your list after you've spent 2 years at Oregon State immersed in poetry, or just in your own life outside of the academic world? Where are you going with poetry?
Well, one of my favorite poets whose work I turn to again and again is Anne Carson, who I think does a lot of brilliant collage work. So I'm looking forward to reading more of her work this summer. She just put out a tiny book called Norma Jean Baker of Troy. It's a play that's kind of about Helen of Troy and Marilyn Monroe, and it's super fabulous. The late Yvonne Boland, who just passed away this spring, has a poetry collection forthcoming called The Historians, of all things. And that's coming out in the fall, and I'm really excited to spend some time with her work because she's long been a hero of mine.
Great. So Anne Carson and
Yvonne Boland.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Brian Richter wants to know, when did you first become aware of your ability to merge poetry with the study of history?
Thank you, Brian. That's a good question. I didn't really start trying to do this in earnest until, it was probably just this last summer, like as recently as that, because I was invited to come back to the Historical Society as an Elliott Fellow, and was sort of given the support to pursue this project. so that's where I really started to try in earnest. I think that there's a long history of poets being inspired by mythology, and so I had done a lot of work in that vein, and so trying to find the mythology in history and to talk about that was definitely part of my transition in the last couple of years.
Well, it's probably worth noting for our audience that the Eliot Fellowship is given each year, and it provides an opportunity for scholars like Eloise to pursue their interests that are in the spirit of the Champlain Society, the group of scholars who came here in the 1880s to really study the environment and whose work led ultimately to the founding of Acadia National Park. Rick Wheeler wants to know, your poetry seems to evolve with your experiences. Where do you think that your poetry will take you this summer? Where would you like it to take you?
Thanks, Rick. Well, first, my poetry is gonna take me on a road trip back to the island from Oregon, which I'm pretty excited about. A very safe, socially distant road trip, very intentional. And I'm looking forward to actually just doing a lot of gardening and cooking this summer. So I'm thinking about maybe trying my hand at cooking and recipe and food inspired poems. So that's one thing that I'm excited about trying.
And where can our viewers find your work?
Well, I've had a poem published recently at an online literary magazine called Under a Warm Green Linden. That's from Green Linden Press, and that's my most recent poem up. So otherwise I'll say stay tuned as I send these poems out for publication.
Ron Beard, I think maybe our last question. He says, I've been reading Philip Booth. You know him?
Not super well, but I'm familiar, I know of him.
Well, he says, it seems like he captures a segment in Maine's time that becomes, as we read it now, history. Any thoughts?
Can you repeat the second part of the question, Tim?
Yes, Ron writes, I've been reading Philip Booth. It seems like he captures a segment in Maine's time that becomes, as we read it now, history. Any thoughts?
Well, not being very familiar with the work of Philip Booth, I'm not sure that I could offer like a very specific thought on that. But I do think that one of the wonderful things about poetry is its ability to both speak to the time that it's in and speak to future generations, which is why we're still reading poets who have been writing for like the last 3,000 years, not just, the last few hundred years of what we're really considering the modern era. So I'd say that that's one of the wonderful, and many art forms are like this, but I think poetry, particularly because of the tradition of the lyric voice, has the power to connect us in a kind of dialogue of togetherness, companionship, just like parallel attention to things. So I'll take that, Ron, as a recommendation that I should check out his work as I'm thinking more about Maine history. Yeah,
Ron, maybe you can put something up on our Facebook page and we can interact on that. I'd love to see an example of Philip Booth's work, and maybe you can introduce our audience to it. Well, Eloise, as it always does, our time has just disappeared. I want to invite our audience to tune in next week, 4:30 Eastern Time. Darcy Stevens, who's a PhD candidate in history at the University of Maine, will be talking about an attempt to establish a French settlement in Lemoyne. It's a fascinating story that is tied to the French Revolution and the flight of emigres to America, where they tried to make a new life for themselves. It's a really well done story. So I hope you can join us. And Eloise, thanks very much for joining us on Chebacco Chats. We're looking forward to your road trip driving finally on the bridge. It'll be great to see you again. Take care as you're traveling, and audience, take care of yourselves, take care of each other. We'll see you next week.